Reform UK are promising a national inquiry into the Boriswave, when almost 4 million third world immigrants were brought into Britain after Brexit under Boris Johnson's government. And so, as well as promising to reverse the Boriswave, send these people home, they're promising to haul the ministers and civil servants responsible before a statutory hearing with possible criminal consequences to find out who is responsible and for what reason was this betrayal carried out. The problem is not that I don't support these measures. I think any self-respecting party should commit to them. The problem is that Reform's personnel are inadequate to carry it out, that they have promised previous inquiries and haven't delivered. Remember, Nigel Farage said he was going to do a privately funded inquiry into the grooming gangs. Rupert Lowe kept his promise on that after being kicked out of Farage's party by Zia Yusuf, the man on screen at the moment, who called the police against him on false grounds. For, as Farage confirmed, Rupert's promise to deport not just the perpetrators but the family members who knew about the crimes and covered them up. And Farage then rubbished Rupert's private inquiry as not worth the paper it was written on, despite a bunch of the survivors who participated coming out and saying, "This is the first time anyone in power has listened to me for years." And the other problem is Reform's own policies. In their brand new report, which is Stop the Boriswave, they're not just inaccurate, they're insufficient. They're not going to send the Boriswave home. So the report itself, other than the hilarious edit of Kemi Badenoch and Boris Johnson standing before thousands of Pashtuns that presumably Robert Jenrick himself helped import into the country, the report points out on page 4. By the way, the page numbers are incorrect in the report, so someone should go back and correct that. Like, this says page 5, but as you can see from the top of the PDF, it's page 4. So just a small error I wanted to point out. It says that between 2021, January 2021, and June 2024, Boris Johnson and his Conservative successors issued a staggering 3.8 million long-term visas, resulting in gross immigration of 4.8 million and net immigration of 2.6 million. Annual net immigration averaged more than double the previous decade, already a period of historically high mass migration. Between 1.6 and 2.2 million Boriswave migrants are now becoming eligible to receive indefinite leave to remain and shortly thereafter citizenship. That's going to be the sticking point. As we'll get to shortly, Reform have already said they are unwilling to strip citizenship from anyone, which means that they can't reverse the Boriswave because by 2029, most of the Boriswave will be eligible for and may have already received British citizenship. They shouldn't have, but Reform aren't willing to take it away. To send the Boriswave home, they promise, on pages 37 and 38 of the document, to abolish ILR as an immigration category completely, meaning no new awards, and those currently holding it will have it rescinded. Indefinite leave to remain allows you to automatically stay in Britain indefinitely if you've been here for 5 years, if you've been able to renew your visa for that long. It then gives you full spectrum access to benefits and welfare, the NHS, the state pension, social housing, and an expedited route to claiming British citizenship. This shouldn't exist. We shouldn't automatically treat anyone who just hangs around long enough as if their ancestors stretch back to the Doomsday Book. It should be abolished outright, and I agree with this move. They say, though, that they're going to replace ILR with a 5-year renewable visa. So people are still going to stay in the country. You're just changing the legal designation and I agree with this again, making it impossible for them to claim benefits and social housing. That's fine, but actually the main problem is the demographic change. It's the fact that people are staying in our country and it is a revolving door for foreigners, and people just don't want that. They want a sense of familiarity. They want to live around their neighbours. They want things to feel permanent and like they possess their own country. And so just replacing it with a 5-year renewable visa, that doesn't solve the core problem that people have and are voting for reform for. Instead, it just says it'll bring the UK in line with comparators like the UAE. They're obsessed with becoming like British Dubai for some reason. Anyone currently with ILR will need to reapply for visas that do not offer recourse to welfare. So the Boriswave will be eligible to reapply for this renewable 5-year visa. So, are you actually getting rid of them? Or are you just saying you need to jump through more paperwork to come back in? The requirements will include much higher salary thresholds, based on a verified job offer, or averaged over the 5-year period in case of renewal, with the right to bring dependents tied to thresholds that will be above median UK earnings. They shouldn't be able to bring dependents. Sorry, we don't want people just bringing over their families. We shouldn't have an endless procession of foreigners bringing their families into our country, changing our culture. That is the primary complaint. Stricter rules around good character, covering deception around the visa application, financial misconduct, tax compliance and criminal convictions, all of which will be much more rigorously checked via biometric information. That's a good policy. And a much higher standard of English. Again, a good policy, pilfered straight from Rupert Lowe. There will also be an acute skills shortage visa available for those working in national critical sectors such as care. That is insane. The Boriswave created the health and social care visa, who brought in more dependents than actual health and social care workers, and for, as Miriam Keynes pointed out in Parliament, I think it was in 2023, for the 70,000 health and social care visas issued in the year 2022 to 2023, it only filled 11,000 vacancies, which means that they come in on the health and social care visa and then just disappear into the system. And this is vastly exploited by African visa mills from Zimbabwe, Ghana, Nigeria. So, why would you keep the care worker visa, which is the absolute worst one? And it says, reform will also increase the minimum qualifying period for British citizenship to 7 years. We shouldn't be giving out new citizenship grants. Even if you are here on a spousal visa, for example, one of the very few visas I think we should even keep, and we should actually improve the ability for people to come over from approved countries, which is basically like Central and Western Europe, the Anglosphere, though, actual members of the Anglosphere, not just Indians with Canadian passports, Japan, Hong Kong, and South Korea. That's about it, right? If we allow those spousal visas to come over, you should have something akin to indefinite leave to remain, though never able to claim benefits or any sort of state funding. And you should be able to stay here indefinitely so long as you don't get divorced. But you shouldn't have British citizenship. Your children can have British citizenship because it is inherited by either their mother or their father. I think probably their father, because actually I don't think we want to bring a bunch of foreign men in. I think spousal visas should probably be only accessible to women, frankly. And the actual spouse themselves shouldn't be a British citizen. You can be an indefinite resident, so long as you remain married, but I don't think we should just be giving out citizenship like you can just sign up to being one of us by putting your hand on a book of any denomination and just swearing a Scout's Pledge of Allegiance that you could just abandon the next day. This is a terrible idea. There should be an indefinite suspension on all new citizenship grants because we're already giving them out at a record rate like they're participation trophies. They say reform is already committed to leaving the ECHR and derogating from or leaving other international conventions that impede border security, repealing the Human Rights Act, and passing the Illegal Migration Mass Deportation Bill. I've discussed the problems with that bill in depth in a video that I'll link down in the description, but I do agree with all these policies. They say as part of these changes, we will, by primary legislation, abolish ILR. Good. New visa categories and thresholds will in parallel be implemented via the immigration rules. Using transitional provision, this will be done on a staggered and orderly basis. But here's the problem. The numbers don't really add up, because they have said that the Boriswave will impose a fiscal cost of £20,000 per household in the UK. The total lifetime cost of the Boriswave, if they receive ILR between 2026 and 2030, is roughly 622.5 billion in real terms if undiscounted, and 154 billion if discounted, at the rate suggested by Her Majesty's Treasury's Green Book. The problem is that these numbers may not be accurate. And Mike Jones points this out. And Mike Jones is worth listening to here, not just because he wrote a very comprehensive article on the Boriswave back in, I think, 2024 for The Critic, but he also used to have input into reform policy. And he is still praiseworthy of some of the measures that reform comes out. So he's not a pure partisan actor. I've met Mike, I've done a podcast with him. He's an upstanding gentleman, and he is undoubtedly an expert on migration. And he says, I thought Reform UK's Boriswave policy launch was strong, and I broadly support its overall thrust. Zia's speech was particularly effective. I disagree here, but I'll go on to that in a moment. But the 20,000 per year family figure simply doesn't hold up. The methodology behind it is weak, and I'm surprised it hasn't been picked apart more widely. And I'm not going to quibble with the methodology. I think Mike has the credibility to make this point. What I'm going to quibble with is putting it in purely economic terms, because the moment you do that, you are on uncertain ground, because people can bring up other numbers to cast your entire narrative into doubt, even people on your side, and so if the numbers are incorrect or disputed, it can discredit your argument, and you're back to arguing the utilitarian calculus of flooding your country full of a bunch of third world immigrants that none of the voters wanted here in the first place. And economic arguments, while they can be useful, obscure the true nature of the thing, which is questions of the possession of our country, whether or not becoming a demographic minority is desirable. It's something that Richard Tice and Nigel Farage have said they don't care about, but it is a pressing concern for most of their voters, and whether or not a democratic system can sustain things being done against the express consent of the voters, and there being no consequences for this. So, all of that is rendered opaque by just coaching this in purely economic terms, and you get bogged down in statistics rather than making an incontestable case that the British people should have the primary exclusive possession of their own country, and the foremost say over its destiny. But while we are quibbling with methodology, I will raise that I don't see a breakdown in skilled workers versus the dependents of skilled workers, primary applicants versus dependents, in Reform's modelling. And given that 95% of the Boriswave are net tax recipients, including some people on skilled worker visas, I think the assumptions that they've made here might be incorrect. The report says on page 20 that skilled workers remain fiscally positive, contributing 12.2 billion in total and 34.8 billion after discounting in the central scenario. In the high scenario, the contributions are 18.2 billion and 52 billion after discounting, and in the low scenario, 9.7 billion and 27.8 billion after discounting. I think that the skilled worker visa is being dragged upwards on average by some exceptional contributors. But we already know that the average wages, thanks to Neil O'Brien MP's modelling on Substack, the average wages of a Nigerian or Indian immigrant have fallen below the median of British workers. So the skilled worker visas, even the primary applicants, are not all net contributors. And we know that some people that received skilled worker visas include those dodgy phone shop technicians and kebab shop chefs. And I'm sorry, even if they're contributing taxes, I don't want my high street terraformed into a second and third world slum. The aesthetics of it, just the people in it, are unwelcome, they're unwanted, they're unfamiliar, and I don't care if they're paying tax and not committing murder. They just shouldn't be here. Presumably, though, although the argument of this paper is directionally correct, Reform thinks that if those people are paying enough tax, they should stay. So, are you actually reversing the Boriswave? Or are you just filtering out most of them because they can't pay tax, and you think the rest of them should be here even though they aren't wanted here? Zia confirms this, by the way. He fleshes out the renewable work visa and the care worker visa in greater depth in his speech, and he says that basically if you do pay enough tax, or we think that you are in a low-paid profession but we need more African care workers, under a Reform government you can stay.
By Nigel will deal with this issue decisively. We will abolish indefinite leave to remain, replacing it with a 5-year renewable work visa with a special visa available to spouses of UK citizens. The work visa will have a much higher salary threshold so that all recipients are net contributors to the economy, and a much higher standard of English will be required. There will also be an acute special skills visa available to those working in national critical sectors like care.
Why does Reform want all the African care workers to stay, rather than decreasing the labour pool available for that profession so that care providers have to provide British people an acceptable living wage in order to do that profession? Because people will do that, women specifically, will go into caring professions if you pay them enough. But the social care sector magnates don't need to pay an acceptable wage for British people. They don't need to give the labourer bargaining power if they can just recruit from the third world who are willing to work for less and send it back home in remittances. Also notable here, by the way, that there were no nudge factors announced in either the mass deportations paper or the Boriswave paper from Reform regarding remittances. There are people in Reform that said remittances should be taxed, but they haven't announced that yet. And so all of these people on 5-year renewable work visas, under Reform's current policy offering, would still be able to pilfer the profits of this country and send them back to the third world. And I'm sorry, I just don't think we should be a piggy bank for India and Africa. It's just not good enough. This pressure, by the way, for keeping care worker visas in place has been coming from Reform for a while, because of Reform's head of Kent County Council, this is Lyndon Kemkaran, and she is of Indian heritage, has written to the government, the Labour government, to complain about Shabana Mahmood's modest immigration reforms, to say that you shouldn't be sending care workers home, and actually the Boriswave should stay. This is the head of Reform's flagship council saying we would actually want Boriswave care workers to stay in the country. So Reform facing pressure to not send them home from prominent figures within their own party, and that is why I am very doubtful that they're going to do this. And this is despite the Boriswave report saying, in the central scenario, care workers amount to a total fiscal cost of 121 billion in real terms, 59 billion after discounting. In the high scenario, the costs are 180 billion and 88.5 billion after discounting. In the low scenario, the costs are 88 billion and 47 billion after discounting. What are we doing here? Why does Reform want to keep imposing this cost on British people? Because it said, well, we don't want the Boriswave here, but we might let some of them stay for care, even though the care workers impose billions of pounds in costs to the taxpayer on us. And so the cracks are already showing in Reform's policy. Charlie Cole, who has contributed to outlets that Reform pilfers its policies from, so he's, again, a very credible voice on this. He does some great work on Commonwealth voting and the Boriswave. He wrote this piece in The Critic late last year, and he points out that because the Boriswave are eligible for indefinite leave to remain starting this year, they would also be eligible for citizenship. And Nigel Farage has already said at a press conference in 2025, no, if you've been granted UK citizenship, you have been granted UK citizenship. To be absolutely clear, there should be no confusion over that. You know, we would not retrospectively change that because you become a legal citizen of this country. We would never ever suggest otherwise. British citizenship has been so hollowed out that there are now questions about Ramadan on the citizenship test. It means nothing anymore, unless it is inherited. And so Nigel Farage thinks that the current settlement on citizenship being handed out like confetti is legitimate. And so he doesn't want to revisit it. Which means that if the Boriswave gets citizenship, Nigel Farage doesn't want to send them home. Zia actually mentioned this during the press conference. They were asked a question, and Zia signalled that he might be prepared to do something about it. But when it comes down to it, I don't think Farage is going to let him.
If people from that 2021-2024 Boriswave have already come here, gain citizenship by the time you're in office, are you accepting that there's nothing you can do retrospectively beyond potentially spending millions of taxpayers' money on this public inquiry?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that one. Look, the reason why, the first thing I said in terms of our message today is to the current government to not U-turn on what Shabana Mahmood has already announced in terms of retrospective ILR reforms. I mean, for a Labour Home Secretary to be announcing that, that wouldn't be happening unless the Treasury were in her ear and the Prime Minister's ear.
Well, unless you'd led the way on the whole ILR debate. It was Zia that led the way with this months ago, to say ILR is a big problem coming down the track, and to quote you, to Shabana Mahmood's credit, she obviously looked at that and ran the numbers and decided at least to kick it under the long grass by pushing it on for a further 5 years. The point about ILR is as soon as you get it, you have automatic rights to full benefits and to bring dependents into this country. So actually, whatever the calculations in here, if things stay as they are, it could be far worse than that. Yeah. If those that get ILR are able to bring lots of dependents who are not contributors to the economy. So look, we are, and on the citizenship point, and if we get to citizenship, well, let's hope it doesn't come to that.
Yeah, look, we're not going to rule anything out, but the reason why we're saying what we're saying today is because we hope it won't come to that, and we think Labour must not U-turn on those retrospective ILR reforms, because they will be baking in a fiscal catastrophe that they recognise is about to happen.
Reform are reluctant, perhaps still unwilling, to repeal citizenships from anyone who's got it, despite that being the power possessed by the Home Secretary, because Shabana Mahmood just did it to an English man for visiting Russia. They've already done it to Shamima Begum. Nigel Farage seems to support doing it for El Fattah, the Egyptian terrorist sympathiser who Keir Starmer brought into the country and gave British citizenship, even though he has never set foot in Britain. He just inherited it from his mother, or eligibility from his mother. So, seemingly, we agree that in certain cases, it's permissible to strip citizenship, but Reform doesn't want to do it for the Boriswave, so they're relying on Shabana Mahmood being able to sustain a rebellion, both from above, via Keir Starmer, and below, from her own discontented backbenchers, to prolong the ILR recipiency period from 5 to, I think it's 10 years, so that they can do their policy. Why are you betting on a Labour government fiddling at the margins for you to avert a demographic and fiscal catastrophe that is awaiting us inevitably? Because presumably, if the Boriswave do get citizenship, Farage is signalling that they're just stuck here forever, and Reform isn't willing to do anything about it. I think we should just strip their citizenship and send them home. I think we should do that for plenty of people. We possess the power, the public are willing to do that. For some reason, Reform isn't. And this is why Max Tempers, the man who popularised the term, although he didn't coin the term, Boriswave, doesn't have faith that Reform are going to do it. Again, it's worth listening to people that are in the British right Reform ecosystem that are saying, guys, I'm on board with this in spirit, but I don't think it's going to work. He says, fundamentally, this doesn't reverse the Boriswave, since it depends entirely on Mike Tapp and Shabana Mahmood getting ILR reforms through, and on the Boriswave not all having become citizens by 2029. It's just another bit of red meat thrown to the base, because Reform realise they're actually slipping in the polls and hemorrhaging their base away to restore, or just to overall apathy that they aren't the anti-establishment force prepared to tackle mass migration that they were purported to be back in 2024. And so then we come to the inquiry, as the Sun reporter accused. Are you just going to spend millions on an inquiry into a complete disaster that you're actually unwilling to reverse if they receive citizenship? The problem with the inquiry is not just that they didn't deliver the rape gang inquiry that they promised before, but it's also who in Reform's going to carry this out? Because is it going to be all of Boris Johnson's cabinet ministers? Because, and look, I've met Suella, she's a really nice woman, but she wasn't a very effective Home Secretary, and she was Home Secretary under Rishi Sunak when the Boriswave continued, and she couldn't actually get the reforms to immigration through the Home Office that she wanted. And then there's Robert Jenrick. Robert Jenrick was the immigration minister under Suella Braverman at the Home Office, and yes, he resigned because he said on Laura Kuenssberg show, I remember it, that the Rwanda plan was never designed to work. It was designed to be a distraction to get the Conservatives across the line at the next election, but they actually didn't want to reverse even illegal immigration, let alone the legal migration they caused. But their culpability while in cabinet, even if it was just ineffectiveness or maybe incompetence, means that Reform are promising to put its own shadow cabinet, its own future cabinet, through an inquiry that could land them in prison? Sorry, wouldn't it be better to just deal with this problem with a set of fresh eyes and clean hands? And I think that's what the public are starting to intuit. The flaws of Reform that it is inherited from the Conservatives are now inextricably baked in. And even worse is Nadim Zahawi. Like, remember, they celebrated Nadim Zahawi's defection back in January. Nadim Zahawi, in 2013, called for a total amnesty for illegal migrants. He debated Douglas Murray at the Oxford Union, saying mass legal migration is good for Britain because Somalians can send home your tax money as remittances, rather than us having to go through foreign aid and give money to corrupt governments. So, either way, your money's going straight to the third world. And he was also a member of Boris Johnson's cabinet and remains unrepentant for the Boriswave. Have you ever heard him apologise for it? Have you ever said they need to send them all home? Of course not, because he's a first-generation Iraqi Kurdish immigrant, and his very presence in our politics relies on that settlement. He is one of David Cameron's diversity hires, and Reform thought it was an absolutely great idea not just to take him in, but to celebrate his defection, and they were going to make him shadow foreign secretary until they realised that their own supporters would abandon them in droves if they announced it. Also, Reform have welcomed Nadine Dorries, Boris Johnson's #1 cheerleader, his fangirl, who has written multiple books defending him, and don't get me wrong, I think she's correct about the sexual sordidness of the Tory party, But the entire thing is designed to make Boris look like the unwitting victim, the tragic hero of the Tory party, when he was the perpetrator of the Boriswave. And again, he just lies about it anytime he's confronted by Harry Cole of The Sun. He just says, oh, it was all Ukrainian refugees and Hong Kong refugees and a few doctors and nurses. And actually, that's not the case. I mean, it's less than 3% of doctors and nurses that came over. And we actually don't train enough of our doctors and nurses up. And those doctors and nurses you got from like India and Nigeria are much more likely to commit medical malpractice. So they don't need to be here. But Reform celebrated Nadine Dorries' defection, and the first thing she did was start arguing that Boris should be allowed into Reform to unite the right. Like, sorry, it's going to be really easy for Reform to run a Boriswave inquiry because the perpetrators are now all in your party, Nigel. This has created the farcical situation of Reform having to grill Robert Jenrick, their own shadow chancellor, at this inquiry if it happens. The same with Suella Braverman. She's already tweeted out that she's prepared to appear and answer any questions. And the reason they're going to have to grill Jenrick is because Jenrick said that welcoming the Afghans, the thousands of Taliban fighters, sex offenders, in the case of Wayne Broadhurst, actual murderers, that were smuggled into our country because of a Ministry of Defence leak, that the government then took out a super injunction against the press to stop them from reporting on it. Robert Jenrick described that and welcoming them as a national project in the Telegraph in 2021. And Zia actually knew this and pointed it out because he tried to coin the term Jenrick Wave when Jenrick was still trying to be the leader of the Conservative Party before he defected to Reform, and Zia's had to sit there eating some humble pie. Now, I'm pretty sure that Zia is actually delighted at the prospect of Robert Jenrick having to testify at this hearing because it eliminates him as the likely successor to Nigel Farage's legacy. Because Zia clearly thought he had quite the comfortable ascension to the Reform throne before Robert Jenrick's defection was orchestrated by forces within Reform. So I'm pretty sure that Zia is happy to take out a contender, but none of this makes Reform look reputable. It looks like asking the arsonists to put out the fire, asking the vandals to tidy up the house. Why should we trust any of these people? And this is allowing the Tories, who, again, are just as responsible for this. Priti Patel is still Kemi Badenoch's Shadow Home Secretary. James Cleverly is still Kemi Badenoch's Deputy Leader. They were both Home Secretary as part of the Boriswave. This allows the Tories to score hits on Reform. A source close to Jenrick said he would absolutely want to take part in the inquiry, adding that he still has plenty to say about the failings of the previous Tory administration. And by the way, Jenrick's team, like Sam Bidwell, were the ones that were mainstreaming ILR as part of the Tory platform, as part of Kemi Badenoch's platform, well before Zia Yusuf had spoken about it. So, as much as I don't like Kemi Badenoch and all the things she's done to the country, it was actually the Tories that were talking about ILR before Reform were. They just have no credibility on the issue. But Chris Philp, who's now the Shadow Home Secretary, a Tory, said, "We look forward to Reform explaining when their new converts will be hauled into the dock to explain the Suella surge and the Jenrick jump." The fact that they can score these alliterative hits on you means that Reform are now just as culpable for the Boriswave as the Tories themselves. We can't trust any of them to do what they promise on this issue. And we especially can't trust Reform because they're running Boriswave members as their candidates at the local elections. For example, Tresius Chitsika, who is a Zimbabwean national who runs care businesses. She is bringing the Boriswave in. She is a Zimbabwean national, not a naturalised immigrant, a Zimbabwean national, and she is a Reform candidate in Southampton in the May elections. Or, for example, Tory Olakoka, who is a Nigerian national running in Southampton, Bannister and Polgon for Reform. Why does Reform want to run these people? Why did Reform accept Aaron Roy, a Labour councillor that defected over to Reform, who is an Indian national, as of the 11th of March 2025, who runs a non-whites-only football team and has received DEI awards, and is proud of it? Reform cannot be trusted to investigate the Boriswave because its candidates are the ministers who brought the Boriswave here and the actual Boriswave themselves. And so when Reform defenders say that Reform is standing in 99% of wards, Britain does not have time for anything other than a serious alternative, vote Reform, get Starmer out, you're standing the Boriswave in those wards while promising to ban the Boriswave from voting in those elections and presumably standing as candidates, and also to send them home? Why would you vote for the Boriswave to get rid of the Boriswave? Matt, Nigel, Zia. this has led to a series of Instagram edits, and I've seen multiple of them, including people clipping me, tag me in them next time, making fun of reform, because reform, people voting reform say, oh, I'm voting for reform to get immigration down. But reform's candidates are actual Boris waivers. They are first-generation immigrants, foreign nationals. And so if you pack your party full of those people, they're going to resist your efforts to send them back. I can't believe that needs to be spelled aloud. So reform can't be trusted to keep their promise, because all of the people that they're putting in their party to do the things they promise either will be forced out as a result of their own policy so they won't vote for it, or they were responsible for bringing those people here in the first place. And so this is why, I think, ahead of the local elections, Reform have dropped 5 points in the more in common polling. They've also dropped in the YouGov polling, the Ipsos polling. Their polling averages down across the board. And look, Gwaine Towler, who is on the Reform board, used to be Nigel Farage's right-hand man before he got Goldman sacked by Zia Yusuf, notes an 8-point swing in a week. Okay, that's quite a thing. Now, it could be that they're overestimating the Kemi bounce. It could be that they're underestimating the Reform vote. But I think a couple of things are going on here. Firstly, ahead of the local elections, I think that people are being pragmatic. And in Conservative areas where they're averse to change, they're thinking, well, I hate the Tories at a national level, but my Conservative local council is doing fine. Like, I don't have that many complaints about my local council. The complaints I do have is that council tax has gone up. And guess where else they've gone up? In Reform councils, which promised not to do so, and Nigel Farage is now, defensively, in every interview where it's raised, denying that Reform ever put they were going to cut tax on local election leaflets, when they did. Even when he's confronted with the printed out leaflet himself, he'll still deny it till he's teal in the face. And so I think people are saying that Reform is not actually that much of a change. Not just because they've allowed Tory, Lib Dem, Labour, Green defectors, and actual members of the Boriswave to run, but it's also because they're thinking, okay, well, I could risk voting Reform, which isn't actually as sure as it once was, that they are just going to get a total electoral sweep at the national or even local elections, and still get a council tax rise, or I could stick with what I already know because I don't really like things changing in my area that much, because they're not that bad. And I think that's the case in like Bexley and Bromley, some of the outer London boroughs, some of the boroughs in the south that are still residual Tory seats. And I think also, people are going to walk in on polling day that aren't paying attention to this, and they're going to look down ballot at the names, and they're going to see the only foreign name is next to Reform UK, and they're going to think, oh, all right then, I'm not voting for, like, a Bangladeshi immigrant. I'll just tick the box next to the Conservatives. That's not an exaggeration, by the way. Remember Adi Asaduzman, the Bangladeshi national running in Southampton? Well, he is the Reform candidate, but look at the other parties. The names are all English, like Lucy Bridgewater for the Greens, Mackenzie Cumming for the Conservatives, Kate Dorrington for the Liberal Democrats, and George David Fielding for the Labour Party. The only person running a foreigner is Reform UK. And so when people go into the election booth and they think, I'm concerned about immigration, I'm concerned about demographic change in my area, I don't want houses of multiple occupancy being set up for Bangladeshis, for example, and they see Reform is running a Bangladeshi but every other party is running an English person, they're going to think, all right, well then I'll just vote for the Conservatives. Hence the slight jump in the recent poll. I think Reform have blundered it, and they're not going to perform as well as they were previously projected. I still think they're going to pick up plenty of seats. But they have taken needless self-inflicted wounds that have lost them local council elections and have meant that they can't really deliver their promise to reverse the Boriswave and hold an inquiry into it when they're standing this guy, Adi Asaduzman, who is here from Bangladesh as part of the Boriswave on a student visa, as a local election candidate. The other problem as well is that Reform is going to keep the institutions in place that brought the Boriswave here. So this is the Office for Budget Responsibility's fiscal projections for November 2023. And this is based on the ONS data at the time. And as you can see here, it said that in the absence of updated population projections, we retained the ONS's 2020-based projections for long-term net migration settling at 245,000, which is also broadly consistent with the government's ambition to bring net migration back to pre-pandemic levels. And so you see their graph projections. They thought that net migration was going to be 245,000 a year. That is what government modelling was. Government policy was based on that modelling. It was actually, as you can see here, 1 1.2 million. Not 245,000, 1.2 million. They were wrong by a factor of 4 to 5 every single year. So, why should the OBR be trusted going forward? Net migration, by the way, was 745,000 in 2022, 685,000 in 2023, and again, 1.2 million in 2024. Would you trust people that kept letting in own goals to remain as the manager of your football team? No. Then why should we trust the OBR to continue to make fiscal modelling for the government? I wouldn't trust them to tell me whether or not the sun was rise tomorrow. But you know who will? Robert Jenrick. Robert Jenrick, as Reform's Shadow Chancellor, despite being a lawyer, in his maiden speech, said we're going to keep the independence, read unaccountability, of the Bank of England, who mismanaged gilt rates, pension funds, interest rates. They lost billions according to their own report. And the Office for Budget Responsibility, an invention of David Cameron and George Osborne. And he also texted George Osborne a copy of his speech saying, I hope you approve. So why is he seeking George Osborne's approval? He said he's going to keep these institutions despite the fact that they have consistently got migration modelling wrong by a factor of 3 to 5 every year under the Boriswave. And the problem is, for those who don't know, government ministers cannot stray from civil service guidance because under the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act of 2010, passed under the Blair and Brown government, the Civil Service Code is in law, which means the civil service must remain politically impartial or neutral. Now, if you think about it for a minute, nobody goes into politics without having political opinions. So the civil service themselves are not apolitical. They have an agenda. What it means is they cannot be held accountable by elected ministers, but they can set the agenda for elected ministers. So it means that an unaccountable, unelected bureaucracy actually runs the country, and they can't be fired even when they get their projections wrong on immigration by a factor of 3 to 5. Reform will continue to take their advice. They think that they can just swap out the people working at the OBR. The problem is, Danny Kruger's civil service reform doesn't repeal the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act 2010. So they can't actually hire and fire most people in civil service. If they try to, they'll be breaking the law. They'll immediately be hit with a judicial review, and they'll waste a lot of time, resources, and political capital on fighting that, when it could just be easier to repeal the legislation, abolish these bodies, and just have your guys in the Treasury doing accurate modelling. So, the frustrating thing is that Robert Jenrick is keeping the OBR in place, which means that if you're going to investigate the culprits of the Boriswave, then you actually can't hold them accountable for doing things wrong, because you have already committed to preserving the independence and faux neutrality of the institution that provided the economic guidance that brought the Boriswave here in the first place. Because remember, as Dominic Cummings has said, Boris Johnson wanted to open up Britain's borders for the Financial Times to like him again, based on Treasury and OBR modelling that says there's going to be labour shortages after lockdown, and you need to protect our pensions and curb inflation by bringing in a raw number of bodies to soak up all the cash that you printed for furlough. The OBR is just as responsible for the Boriswave as Robert Jenrick, as Priti Patel, as Boris Johnson. But Reform are committed to keeping the OBR in place, which means they cannot be held accountable, because they're just going to give out the answer, as will most of the ministers, by the way, that they were just following the guidance. They were just following the law. They were just following orders. And so they won't be held accountable for this, because Reform have already committed to the moral framework that allowed the faulty modelling to set the government's agenda that caused the Boriswave. And so you have to wonder, are Reform going to accidentally do the Boriswave as well? Is there going to be a Farage wave? And Farage denies this, right? He wrote, after the announcement of this inquiry in the Telegraph, remind me, when did the British people vote to allow the mass immigration of millions of low-skilled foreign nationals, many of whom don't work and never will? Immigrants who will cost the British taxpayer hundreds of billions, a national bill that breaks down to 20,000 for every single UK household and could bankrupt the country. Actually, you did, Nigel. Nigel did. Back in 2015, at the election. He says he prefers Indian immigrants to Poles, because apparently Indians abide by the law. That's not true. The level of scamming, the level of ethnic nepotism, the sacking entire companies and rehiring their ethnic kin straight from India, which both Boris Johnson and now Keir Starmer's Indian trade deal have made way easier to do. And Farage even said at the time, He doesn't hate multiculturalism. He hates Britain had made a real mistake with state-sponsored multiculturalism. So presumably, if everyone just lives in like sequestered ethnic and cultural ghettos dotted around the country, Nigel Farage is fine with that. He doesn't want to talk about demographic change, and he's not opposed to multiculturalism in principle, and actually he prefers Indians to, largely, high-skilled, practical, law-abiding, English-speaking, Christian European Poles. No, I way prefer the Poles to Indians. I've met plenty of really lovely Poles. And the biggest barrier is the frankness with which they speak, and them going into obsessive detail about Polish history because they really like to tell you about Polish history. It's like meeting an autistic child and asking them what their favourite dinosaur or train is. That's just Poles of Polish history. It's quite endearing. I can put up with that, right? In small numbers, so that it doesn't like overstress public services, put undue pressure on housing, healthcare, things like that. That's when you can talk about economics. It is a civilizational threat to bring in millions of Indians. The crazy thing is, Farage was repeatedly saying this. He said Indian and Australian immigrants are better than Eastern Europeans. Okay, it's like that meme from the film Civil War. What kind of Australian? Like, actual Australians, yeah, because they're Brits. They have a slightly different sense of humour, and they can drink a lot more than we can, and that's saying a lot, but they're still Brits. I am very happy to take in actual Aussies with a sort of right of return policy back to the motherland. But Indians? Like, you can't just smuggle that in there. Like, Indians have a completely different collectivist, shame-oriented moral system to us. They will lie, cheat, and steal to save face. The level of sexual assaults. And just also like things like casual littering and a disrespect for common spaces. You know, putting their feet up on train seats, playing music aloud. Like, desperately rushing to take things that are free because they think that things are scarce, and so you can't queue, you can't take things one at a time. Sort of thing that Lee Kuan Yew, when he visited a box full of newspapers in Piccadilly Circus and watched English people taking one and leaving their coin and said, "This is civilization." You can't have that sort of thing if you bring in loads of Indians into the country. But Nigel Farage wanted that. He also said we should take in more Syrian refugees. On LBC. More Syrians.
Huge level of myth in this over the last couple of days. We already accept refugees and asylum seekers every year. There were 25,000 applications for asylum in Britain last year. There were more than that the year before. Actually, without changing the numbers at all, we can allow more Syrians to come to Britain. I don't see that as a problem.
I see it as a problem, Nigel. Now, you might say, well, this was a few years ago, he's probably changed his mind. In January, he was at the World Economic Forum, and he actually said that we've turned our backs on India. After the Boriswave, where we brought in 250,000 Indians every single year, apparently Nigel Farage thinks that constitutes turning our backs on India and not making use of the hypothetical wellspring of talent. You can just smell the GDP from India that, for some reason, can't be effective in India, but will be effective when we bring them over and allow them to live like they're in India while in Britain. Like, Nigel Farage wants more Indian migration. He's said it as much. That is insane.
I just think we've underutilised the amazing advantages we have across the rest of the world. You know, we turned our backs on India, we turned our backs on the Commonwealth countries in the 70s. We decided that Europe was our future. That became the sort of foreign office and political priority over decades. And we've turned our backs on large parts of the world where there is still a remarkable relationship between those former colonies and ourselves. So we need to think more globally in every way.
I think we need to think much less globally, actually, and we don't only not need any more Indian immigration, because if more Indians were the solution to our problems, we wouldn't have any problems, and India wouldn't have any problems. I think we need vast numbers of those migrants, Indian and otherwise, to go home. They shouldn't be here. They shouldn't be eligible for a 5-year renewable work visa instead of ILR. They shouldn't be eligible to stay as low-wage care workers. We shouldn't be looking to India for our economic fortunes. They should go back to their home countries and leave us in peace. And Farage has a really weird hang-up about India, because when the Liberal Democrat guest brought up the rates of sex offences by nationality on his show during a discussion about the topic, when she said that actually, on a gross level, Indians are the largest number of perpetrators. You know, Afghans and Eritreans are per capita more likely to commit a sex offence, but the most common nationality for sex offences were Indian. He quickly shut down that conversation.
And the stats also show
they're
that
worrying.
the single biggest group of people committing sexual offences are from India.
Well, that depends.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, there is a religious element to this too. I tell you what, I'm going to draw stumps because we could go on this forever, but I do feel that this is going to become a much, much bigger issue and a more explosive issue.
Is he worried about losing potential economic and geostrategic ties with India? Is he worried about losing a hypothetical voter base of Hindus and Sikhs that are opposed to Muslims, despite the fact he also feels the need to fill his party with Muslims and appease Islam, per his comments on the Winston Marshall show? Is he truly a doctrinaire anti-racist that doesn't want to have negative characterizations of groups, no matter how those groups behave as groups? It's perplexing, but for some reason, Farage is like obsessed with India, and the largest contingent of Boriswave migrants are from India, and the Home Secretary that brought them here is Indian, and the Prime Minister that refused to reverse the policies that enabled the Boriswave, Rishi Sunak, is Indian. So, will Nigel Farage's strange fixation with India contaminate the inquiry? Much like the Labour government's Pakistani grooming gang inquiry isn't going to investigate the role of Islam or of ethnic disparities between white English victims and Pakistani perpetrators, because they don't want to alienate the Muslim vote and because there are lots of Pakistani Muslims in Labour itself. It's clear that when you're worried about losing vested interests, you can never be truthful. And so Reform's Boriswave inquiry is unlikely to deliver as promised. They're also not going to send the Boriswave home if they're a care worker, or if they renew their visa using one of the brand new 5-year renewable visas, or if they have citizenship, because Nigel Farage doesn't want to repeal it. And so, can we trust them to carry it out when the people carrying it out are Boris Johnson's cabinet ministers, and the party at a local level is full of actual Boriswave migrants? Like, how embarrassing for Reform would it be to say, we're going to send our own candidates back to the countries they came from? And I think this is just why people are really becoming disenchanted with Reform. They're falling in the polls, they're losing their membership. I mean, their membership ticker hasn't been on the website for quite some time. There have been council defections, resignations, student societies have disbanded. It's not trending well. And I think he can feel the hot breath of Restore Britain on his neck. And this is why Farage got very defensive when speaking to the Daily Express on a private jet when asked about Rupert Lowe.
And the Lowe thing, it's one angry man saying stuff on the internet. Look, let him do what he wants. He doesn't marry me.
Does that look like a face of a man who's not worried? Because consistently, Restore Britain are polling between 4 and 8% on YouGov and More in Common polls. That is a significant share of Reform's voter base that were deactivated when they became disillusioned with Reform, and have now been reactivated by Restore Britain, as well as a significant number of people who have either never been involved in a political party. You hear this across the country in local branch meetings that are now starting. I'm going to be attending some of them soon myself. But also people that just haven't voted. People that felt that there's never been an authentic political party that represents their interests, and now there is one. And so Farage now feels the pressure to his right with someone who is more credible, because he actually delivered on an independent inquiry that he promised on the worst scandal in British history that also Farage promised and didn't deliver, and then said wasn't worth doing in the first place. And that party isn't full of former Tories and actual Boriswave migrants, so when they do want to reverse the Boriswave, and immigration prior to the Boriswave, when they do want to send millions home, they don't have anyone in their party whispering in the ear of Rupert like Wormtongue, discouraging him from doing it. They don't have any vested interests or lobbyists that might lose out if all of that unwanted cheap labour goes home. And I think that's why, as the Daily T acknowledge, Reform are quaking in their boots about Restore, because they have already internally modelled that if Restore get anything above 3%, they're cooked.
Rupert Hoopert Lowe, as we like to call him, because he has been slightly conspicuous by his absence from anywhere other than X, They're on 4%.
Well, he's not entirely Hoopered, is he? Because that's quite good.
I know, and this is worrying for Farage, isn't it, Tony? Because haven't the Reform lot done a calculation that if Restore gets anything over 3%, then they're a bit screwed?
Yeah, well, I mean, what's funny now is we used to talk about Reform splitting the right-wing vote. Now we're talking about Restore splitting the Reform vote. I mean, everything is just becoming totally fractured, as we'll get onto in our New Divided Britain series. But I think, if you look at the polling numbers, Reform were touching 30%. There were a couple of polls that had them over 30% a few weeks ago. Now they're back down to 24. The general polling average is about 23. And then you've got this kind of cluster about 4 points below, which is depending on what poll you look at, it's Labour, the Tories, the Greens, all together. So
Reform's vote share has peaked, dipped, stagnated, and then is continuing to fall. The waves are lapping against the shoreline. They are eroding the Reform cliffs. And I think this is why Farage seems cantankerous, a bit insecure about his own position, and it's why Reform are now trying to pilfer policies and rhetoric from their right, from Restore Britain, because they realise that the Ming-Vase strategy didn't work. The hands are slipping. They estranged the online right. They thought that we would run in place and wait for them as the only option, and that they could just, report Rupert to police and cast him out into the political darkness and he'd go away quietly. And none of this has worked out. These are all self-inflicted wounds. You didn't need to invite most of Boris Johnson's cabinet into your party with fireworks and fanfare. You didn't need to stand foreign nationals as candidates. You didn't need to stand the Boriswave as your local election candidates. You didn't need to destroy your own credibility. You didn't need to estrange your own base. You didn't need to mistreat your local branch organisers. You didn't need to denounce anyone who was an inch to the right of you a day earlier. You didn't need to allow MI5 and Hope Not Hate to vet your candidates. All of these things were totally avoidable. You were warned against doing them. You've done them. And now you're suffering the consequences. And so, YouGov already has Restore Britain on 4% without prompting. When they do prompt, they're on 8% consistently in More in Common polls. When the prompting starts, when word of mouth gets around, when local branches become a regular thing, when, and it was very disingenuous of Camilla Tominey to say Rupert is conspicuously absent because he's banned from GB News, he's barely on Talk TV, and the Daily Tea haven't invited him or any of Restore's surrogates on, and I've texted Tim Stanley saying, it's a bit unfair calling us all brown shirts, wouldn't you like to discuss this? And it was left unread and wasn't responded to, so, not very good faith. But when Rupert starts gaining more media presence, I think an increasing vote share from Reform UK is going to bleed away to Restore Britain, because they're going to see that Restore Britain is the party that Reform were meant to be, that they misled their own voters into thinking they were and still are. And instead, Reform is now just the party of the ministers who caused the Boriswave and actual Boriswave migrants themselves. And I'm not voting for that. And I don't trust them to either hold an inquiry into why it happened or to send those people home. I would rather Rupert did it instead.